In the humid, shadowed history of Natchez, Mississippi, some stories are not written in ink, but are sealed in iron and buried beneath the ash of forgotten crimes. This is the horrific tale of a beautiful young slave named Celeste, a woman who gave birth to the shepherd's children, the sons of a powerful plantation family. Before the age of 25, she and her 2 infant boys would disappear from all official records, erased by a tragedy that the community chose to explain as a simple, desperate flight. But the truth of what happened in 1844 was far more macabre, a mystery of vengeance so profound it would lie dormant for over a century. What could drive a mother to commit an act so unthinkable that it defies all moral comprehension? And how could a crime of such magnitude be so effectively buried that it dissolved into local legend, a ghost story whispered on the banks of the Mississippi? The answers were preserved in a place no one thought to look, waiting for the day they would be unearthed. This is the story of the terrible justice Celeste claimed for herself, and the 2 small children who became the instruments of her final, devastating act of rebellion. If you believe that some stories must be told, no matter how unsettling, then we invite you to subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss these deep historical investigations. Your support is crucial, so please consider liking this video if you value our work. We are building a community dedicated to unearthing the truths that time has tried to forget. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The official history of Adams County, Mississippi, is one of immense cotton wealth, of stately antebellum mansions lining the bluffs above the river, and of pious, God-fearing families who built an empire on the backs of the enslaved. Among the most prominent of these were the shepherds, whose sprawling plantation was known for its productivity and for the stern moral authority of its patriarch, the Reverend Alistair Shepherd. His private letters, preserved in the state archives, speak of a world ordered by divine providence, a society where every man, woman, and child knew their designated place in a rigid, unassailable hierarchy that served God and commerce in equal measure. It is within these same archives, however, that the first thread of a darker narrative appears, a single-line item in a plantation ledger dated April 1841, records a transaction with the cold finality of any other business dealing. It reads simply, "Purchased, 1 house girl, Celeste, approx. 16 years, from the Kendall estate, sound of limb and temperament." This entry marks Celeste's arrival into a world that would own her body, but could never extinguish the fire of her spirit. She was brought to the Shepherd plantation not merely for her labor, but for a beauty that was noted even in the dehumanizing language of the sales record, a quality that would prove to be both a curse and a catalyst. The world Celeste entered was one of suffocating control, where the rustle of magnolia leaves and the scent of sweet olive masked a system of profound violence. The Shepherd family's reputation was built on a foundation of public piety. Sunday sermons delivered by the Reverend spoke of mercy and salvation, while the daily reality of the plantation was one of backbreaking labor and the ever-present threat of the overseer's lash. Celeste was assigned to the main house, a position that removed her from the brutality of the fields, but placed her directly under the watchful and often predatory gaze of the family she was forced to serve day and night. Her existence was meant to be invisible, a series of silent, obedient actions that kept the great house running. She was to be a ghost in the hallways, present only as a pair of hands to serve a meal, mend a garment, or stoke a fire. Yet, from the moment of her arrival, her presence was anything but invisible. The letters of Eleanor Shepherd, the family matriarch, soon began to carry a new undercurrent of disquiet. She writes of a house girl whose obedience is flawless, yet whose eyes hold a depth that she finds unnerving, a silent watchfulness that seems to register every hypocrisy, every cruelty, with an intelligence that was not supposed to exist in a person considered to be property. This initial perception of Celeste as a disquieting presence would only deepen over the following months. She learned the rhythms of the house, the unspoken rules, the secrets that festered behind the closed doors of the family's private chambers. She saw the chasm between the Shepherd's public image and their private reality. Jonathan Shepherd, the eldest son and heir, was a man who performed the role of a dutiful son in public, but moved through the slave quarters with an air of absolute predatory ownership. His attention, as documented in the faintest of hints in his mother's letters, would soon turn toward the young, beautiful woman who served his family their daily meals. The Shepherd plantation, like so many others in Natchez, was a closed system, a small kingdom ruled by the absolute power of its master. There was no court of appeal, no external authority to which an enslaved person could turn for protection. Justice was a concept that did not apply. An enslaved woman's body was not her own. It was an asset, an instrument for labor and for the production of more property. Celeste understood this reality not as an abstract principle, but as a daily, lived experience. The air she breathed was thick with the threat of violation, a constant low-grade terror that was the price of survival in the humid lowlands of Mississippi. It was in this crucible of piety and cruelty that Celeste's story would unfold. She was a single, anonymous figure among hundreds of thousands, her life intended to be consumed by the cotton economy and forgotten by history. The sparse documentary record of her existence, a line in a ledger, a name in a parish register, was designed to tell a story of ownership and compliance. But within the gaps of that official record, between the lines of frightened letters and the silence of a sheriff's report, lies a testament to a rebellion so total and so horrific that it could only have been born from a place where hope had been utterly extinguished. The year 1958 provides the key that unlocks this buried history. A team of state surveyors, tasked with mapping the land for a new highway, began a routine excavation on the overgrown, derelict grounds of the former Shepherd estate. The main house had burned down decades earlier, leaving only a collapsed foundation and a solitary, defiant chimney stack. It was there, beneath the central hearthstone of what was once the kitchen, that their shovels struck not stone, but iron. What they unearthed that day was not a relic of a genteel past, but a sealed vessel containing a secret that would challenge the very foundations of the region's accepted history. Inside that pot, the archaeological report would later state, with clinical detachment, were the scorched fragments of linen, 2 small human jawbones, and a piece of parchment, its message preserved by the airtight darkness. This single shocking artifact serves as the true beginning of the story, the irrefutable physical evidence of a macabre crime that demanded an explanation. It is the anchor point to which all the fragmented testimonies and censored records must now be tied, forcing us to look back and reconstruct the events that led to such a desperate final act of preservation and vengeance. The first official record of Celeste's life beyond her purchase appears in the St. Mary Parish Baptismal Register for the year 1842. The entry is brief, written in the elegant looping script of the parish clerk. It documents the baptism of a male infant, designated only as George, his mother listed as Celeste, a servant of the Shepherd estate. Beside the space reserved for the father's name, there is a stark, deliberate emptiness. This blank space is the first documented anomaly, a silent but profound testament to a truth that could not be officially acknowledged. The child was property, and his paternity was a matter of legal and social inconvenience, best left unrecorded. A year later, in 1843, the same register contains a nearly identical entry. Another son, named Samuel, is baptized. Once again, his mother is listed as Celeste, and once again the father's name is omitted. These two entries, read in succession, establish a clear pattern. Within 2 years of her arrival, the young woman described as a house girl had borne 2 children. In the eyes of the law and the church, these children had no father. They were simply an increase in the shepherd family's human stock, their lineage intentionally severed, their existence defined solely by their bondage. But in the enslaved community, the truth was whispered, an open secret that carried with it both fear and sorrow. The only known account of these births from within that community survives through a remarkable historical accident. In 1934, during the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration dispatched interviewers across the South to collect the life stories of formerly enslaved people. In a dusty corner of a Natchez archive, a fragile audio recording preserves the voice of an elderly woman named Martha Rose Jackson. Her mother had been the midwife on the shepherd plantation, a woman who had delivered hundreds of children, but who was uniquely haunted by the birth of Celeste's second son. Martha Rose recounted her mother's story with a quiet, solemn gravity. She described Celeste's labor as unnaturally silent, a terrifying display of controlled endurance. There were no cries, no pleas, only a focused, grim determination. The midwife, a veteran of such scenes, was deeply unsettled by the absence of any sound, as if the young woman was refusing to give the house, the world, the satisfaction of her pain. It was an act of defiance so profound that it chilled the very air in the small, dark cabin, a silence that felt louder and more powerful than any scream. The true anomaly, however, came after the child was born. As the midwife cleaned the infant, she heard Celeste begin to whisper to him, her voice low and steady. The words, as recalled by Martha Rose from her mother's telling, were not a lullaby, but a vow. She was heard to say, "You will not draw breath in this house long enough to call that man master." The midwife was so terrified by the cold, resolute finality in Celeste's tone that she pretended not to have heard. She understood in that moment that she was bearing witness to a promise that transgressed every law of God and man. This testimony, captured on a crackling phonograph record nearly a century after the event, provides the first glimpse into Celeste's inner world. It reframes her from a passive victim into an active agent, a mother who, at the moment of her son's birth, was already contemplating an unthinkable act of liberation. Her promise was not a threat born of fleeting anger, but a declaration of a deeply held conviction that a life in bondage under the shepherds was a fate worse than death itself, a spiritual damnation from which she was resolved to spare her children by any means necessary. The midwife, according to her daughter, never spoke of that night to another soul on the plantation. She carried the secret with her, a heavy stone in her heart, for the rest of her life. She watched Celeste raise her 2 boys with a quiet, fierce tenderness that seemed to contradict the terrible promise she had made, but the midwife knew what she had heard. She recognized the look in Celeste's eyes as something ancient and unbreakable, the resolve of a person who had been pushed past the limits of endurance and had arrived at a place of terrible, absolute clarity. The oral testimony of a single, uneducated woman's daughter, recorded decades after the fact, holds little weight against the official, written records of the time. It is hearsay folklore, a ghost story from a painful past. And yet, when placed alongside the cold, clinical discovery of 2 infant jawbones buried beneath a kitchen hearth, Martha Rose's account takes on the chilling resonance of prophecy. It suggests that the horrific events of 1844 were not a sudden, impulsive act, but the fulfillment of a promise made in the dark, a final, desperate settlement of a debt that could only be paid in blood. The blank spaces in the parish register and the whispered words in the birthing cabin represent two sides of the same hidden truth. The official record erases the father to protect the honor of a powerful white family, while the oral history records a mother's vow to erase her children from the world of bondage to protect their souls. Together they form the foundation of this macabre mystery, pointing toward a conclusion so disturbing that for more than 100 years it remained not only unspoken, but almost entirely unimagined. The period between the birth of Celeste's second son in 1843 and the tragic autumn of 1844 is documented primarily through the private correspondence of Eleanor Shepherd. Her letters to her sister in Vicksburg, never intended for public view, become an unwitting chronicle of the rising tension within the great house. Without ever naming the source of her anxiety, she paints a portrait of a domestic space that is slowly becoming poisoned by its own secrets. She writes of Celeste's demeanor, which has shifted from a silent watchfulness to what she describes as an unnatural melancholy, a deep, brooding sorrow that seems to cling to the very air around her. This melancholy, Eleanor notes, is most pronounced when Celeste is with her two young sons. She describes the young mother's affection as possessing a fierce, possessive air that she finds deeply unsettling in a person who was, by law, not even entitled to her own children. Celeste's love was not the gentle, subservient affection expected of a servant. It was a powerful, proprietary claim, an unspoken declaration of ownership that directly challenged the authority of the Shepherd family itself. Eleanor, sensing this challenge but unable to articulate it, records only her discomfort, her sense that something is fundamentally wrong in her well-ordered household. The letters also contain veiled, anxious references to her own eldest son, Jonathan. She notes his special interest in Celeste's boys, describing how he occasionally brings them small, cast-off toys from his own children's nursery. She frames these acts as moments of casual, benevolent paternalism, yet the nervous energy of her writing suggests she knows the truth. Jonathan was not merely being kind, he was observing his unacknowledged offspring, a constant living reminder of a transgression that threatened the fragile veneer of his family's Christian respectability. His presence was a source of unspoken shame for his mother and a source of quiet, simmering rage for the woman he had violated. The plantation's financial ledgers from this period provide a colder, more quantifiable form of evidence. They meticulously record every expenditure, from the purchase of new plows to the barrels of salt pork allocated to the slave quarters. These documents reveal the stark disparity between the two sets of children living under the Shepherd roof. There are entries for fine-tailored clothing, imported sweets, and expensive wooden toys for Jonathan's legitimate children. In contrast, Celeste's cabin is allocated only the barest, most basic rations, with no mention of any provisions for her two infant sons. Their material existence was as unacknowledged as their paternity. This documentary silence is a powerful form of evidence in itself. It confirms that George and Samuel were not seen as part of any family unit, but as future laborers, their needs irrelevant until they were old enough to work. This systematic neglect, this institutional denial of their most basic needs, must have served as a constant, brutal reminder to Celeste of their status in the world. They were her sons, born of her body, but in the eyes of the system that held her captive, they were nothing more than a future entry on a list of assets, their lives measured not in love, but in potential profit. The cumulative weight of these fragmented pieces of evidence, The anxious letters, the cold ledgers, the remembered whispers paints a picture of a psychological pressure cooker. On one side was the Shepherd family, desperate to maintain a facade of moral purity while grappling with the undeniable evidence of their son's sin. On the other was Celeste, forced to live in intimate proximity to the man who had assaulted her, forced to raise his children as slaves, and forced to watch as they were treated as less than human, all while her own legitimate children enjoyed every privilege. It was an arrangement of such profound psychological violence that it could not possibly be sustained indefinitely. Eleanor Shepherd's final letter from this period, dated just weeks before the tragedy, is filled with a sense of impending doom she cannot name. She writes of sleepless nights, of a feeling of being watched, of a heavy stillness that has fallen over the house. She complains that the food has begun to taste strange, that Celeste's cooking has acquired a bitter, earthy quality she cannot identify. She dismisses it as a fancy, a product of her own frayed nerves, but her words read now as a chilling premonition of the horror that was about to unfold. The evidence suggests a deliberate, methodical campaign of psychological warfare. Celeste, powerless to challenge her oppressors directly, may have begun to use the one tool she had at her disposal, her role as the family cook. The strange taste in the food, the growing sense of unease in the house, these may have been the opening moves in her final, desperate gambit. She was not merely a servant, she was the gatekeeper to the family's very sustenance, and she was beginning to turn that small measure of power into a weapon. In retrospect, the accumulation of these anomalies points to an inevitable conclusion. The Shepherd house was not a home, but a stage for a slow, unfolding tragedy. Every character was playing a part: the pious patriarch, the anxious matriarch, the hypocritical son, and the silent, watchful slave. But one of these actors was secretly rewriting the script, preparing for a final act that would burn the entire production to the ground, leaving nothing behind but ash, bone, and a story that would take more than a century to be pieced back together. The first official attempt to explain the horrific events of autumn 1844 is preserved in the leather-bound journal of Dr. Abram Fell, the physician who served the white planter families of Natchez. His entries, written in a precise scientific hand, provide a chillingly detached account of the night he was summoned to the Shepherd plantation. He was met at the door by a frantic Jonathan Shepherd, his face pale with terror, who led him to the upstairs nursery, where his two legitimate children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, lay writhing in their beds. Dr. Fell's clinical descriptions of their symptoms are graphic and filled with a sense of his own professional helplessness. He documents a sudden, violent onset of convulsions, a raging fever that did not respond to cold compresses, and a progressive paralysis that started in the limbs and crept inexorably toward the heart. He notes the presence of a strange, dark vomit, which he describes as having an unusual plant-like odor that he could not identify from any known medical text. He administered laudanum to ease their suffering, but he knew from the outset that there was nothing he could do. The children were in the grip of a poison so swift and so potent that it defied every medical intervention available at the time. Dr. Fell's journal reveals his struggle to diagnose the mysterious affliction. He considered and then dismissed a series of possibilities, his methodical process of elimination a testament to his bafflement. It was not the swamp fever common to the Mississippi lowlands, nor was it the cholera that sometimes swept through the river towns. The symptoms were too specific, too violent, too targeted. He noted that no one else in the household, including the parents who had eaten the same evening meal, had fallen ill. The affliction, whatever it was, had been directed solely and with terrifying precision at the two young shepherd heirs. His attention, and that of the distraught family, quickly turned to the source of the evening meal. The Reverend Shepherd, in a state of enraged grief, insisted that the children had been poisoned, that this was not an act of God, but an act of deliberate, malicious evil. He pointed the finger of blame squarely at the one person who had prepared the food, the family cook, Celeste. Dr. Fell, in his journal, records this accusation without comment, but it is clear from the direction of his subsequent inquiries that he accepted it as the most plausible explanation for a medically inexplicable event. The hypothesis began to solidify when a search of the plantation grounds revealed that Celeste and her two sons were missing. Her cabin, located a short distance from the main house, was found to be empty, its door slightly ajar. To the Shepherd family and to Dr. Fell, this disappearance was an admission of guilt. The narrative quickly formed. The slave girl, in an act of profound negligence, had accidentally contaminated the children's food with a poisonous herb or fungus, and upon realizing her fatal mistake, had fled into the nearby swamps in a blind panic to escape the certain and brutal punishment that awaited her. This version of events offered a convenient and socially acceptable explanation for an otherwise unthinkable tragedy. It centered the blame on the carelessness of an enslaved person, reinforcing the prevailing racist stereotypes of the time. It transformed a potential act of deliberate rebellion into a simple case of incompetence followed by cowardice. This hypothesis, born in a moment of grief and panic, allowed the Shepherd family to frame themselves as the sole victims of the tragedy, their innocence unquestionable, their loss absolute. It was a story that the community was ready and willing to believe. Dr. Fell's final entry on the matter is telling. After recording the deaths of the two children just before dawn, he concludes with a note of weary resignation. He writes, "The family is consumed by a righteous sorrow. Their only consolation lies in the belief that justice will be swift for the servant who has brought this ruin upon their house. I have advised the sheriff to organize a search party at first light." His role as a man of science was over. The matter was now in the hands of the law, and the law in 1840s Mississippi had little interest in nuance or evidence when the accused was enslaved. The doctor's journal, therefore, represents the creation of the official myth. It is the primary source for the first hypothesis, a theory formulated under duress and shaped by the prejudices of the era. It presents a logical, if tragic, sequence of events that neatly explains the deaths and the disappearance. But his own meticulous descriptions of the highly specific nature of the poisoning, the fact that it targeted only the children, hint at a deeper, more disturbing truth that his hypothesis conveniently overlooks. This initial explanation, however, would prove to be powerful enough to endure. It was the story that would be entered into the official record, the one that would be told and retold in the parlors of Natchez. It was a story that required no difficult questions, no uncomfortable self-examination on the part of the slave-owning community. The beautiful, silent cook had made a mistake and fled. It was a simple, tragic accident. The case, for all intents and purposes, was already closed before it had ever been truly opened. The official response to the tragedy at the Shepherd plantation is documented in a single, stark report filed by the Adams County Sheriff, a man named Bo Brody. The document, dated 2 weeks after the deaths of the children, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic indifference and social reinforcement. It serves not as a record of an investigation, but as the final authoritative stamp on the hypothesis formulated by Dr. Fell and the Shepherd family. The report formally codifies the convenient lie into historical fact, creating a social fracture between the official narrative and the unrecorded whispered truths of the enslaved community. The sheriff's report is brutally concise, its language clipped and devoid of any human empathy. It begins by stating the known facts. The two legitimate children of Reverend Alistair Shepherd had expired from a mysterious ailment of the stomach. Dully, it then notes the immediate disappearance of the Negro cook, Celeste, and her two male offspring. The very structure of the sentences creates a causal link, implying that the second fact is the clear and obvious explanation for the first. There is no mention of any investigation into the nature of the ailment, no record of any interviews with other servants, no consideration of any alternative possibilities. The most telling section of the report deals with the discovery of Celeste's burned-out cabin. A cursory inspection, the sheriff writes, concluded that the fire was the result of a stray ember from the hearth, a common and unremarkable accident. This ruling effectively erased any possibility that the fire was deliberately set, that it was an act of concealment or a final symbolic severing of ties. It was deemed an accident, a random act of fate that conveniently aligned with the narrative of a panicked and careless servant. The possibility of arson, an act of conscious will, was never even entertained. By officially ruling the fire an accident and accepting the family's narrative of flight, the report performs a crucial social function. It contains the horror of the event and prevents it from spilling over into the wider community and raising uncomfortable questions. If this was a deliberate act of resistance by an enslaved person, it would imply a fundamental instability in the system of slavery itself. It would mean that any master in any house could be vulnerable. It was a possibility so terrifying that it could not be officially acknowledged. The social order depended on the belief that the enslaved were either content or at least effectively controlled. The report concludes with a simple, chilling declaration: case closed. With those two words, Celeste and her children were officially erased from the historical record. They ceased to be subjects of a legal inquiry and became fugitives, their guilt assumed, their fate a matter of indifference to the authorities. The full weight of the county's legal and social apparatus was used not to find the truth, but to bury it under a plausible and socially necessary fiction. This act of institutional erasure was the true social fracture, a moment when the community collectively agreed to accept a lie in order to preserve its own peace of mind and the stability of its economic system. The acceptance of this narrative was swift and total, at least among the white population of Natchez. The Shepherd family was enveloped in a wave of communal sympathy. They were seen as blameless victims of a tragic, random event, their suffering a testament to the unpredictable dangers of their world. The local newspaper printed a brief maudlin obituary for the children, making no mention of the circumstances of their deaths, only of the profound grief of their devout and respected family. The silence surrounding the cause of death was another layer of the communal agreement to not look too closely at the darkness that had erupted in their midst. For the enslaved community, however, the closure of the case was not an end, but the beginning of a different kind of memory. They knew Jonathan Shepherd's character. They knew the circumstances of Celeste's children's births. They had seen the look in her eyes. While they may not have known the specific details of what happened in the kitchen that night, they understood that this was no accident. The official story was a lie, a thin cloak thrown over a truth that was far more complex and disturbing. Celeste's disappearance became the stuff of legend, a whispered story of a woman who had refused to break. This divergence in memory, The white community's story of a tragic accident and the black community's story of a terrible rebellion is the essence of the social fracture. The official record, the written word controlled by those in power, tells one story. The oral tradition, the whispered history of the powerless, tells another. For over a century, these two narratives would run parallel to each other, never touching, one preserved in archives and the other in memory. It would take the accidental discovery of a sealed iron pot to finally force them to collide. The sheriff's report, therefore, is more than just a legal document. It is an artifact of a society's deep-seated need to control its own narrative, to manage its own fears by simplifying and sanitizing the horrors it produces. It represents the moment when the community chose willful blindness over a terrifying truth. In closing the case on Celeste, Sheriff Brody was not just ending an investigation. He was actively participating in the burial of a history that the powerful did not want known, ensuring that the full story of what happened on the Shepherd plantation would remain for a time, a secret known only to the dead. For 90 years, the official record stood unchallenged. The story of the negligent cook who fled in panic was the only one that survived in the written archives. But in 1934, a WPA interviewer, armed with a primitive recording device, sat on a porch in Naames and captured a testimony that served as the first piece of irrefutable evidence to contradict that long-held narrative. The voice of Martha Rose Jackson, recalling the story told to her by her midwife mother, provided the only known eyewitness account of Celeste's final deliberate movements. Her testimony did not describe a woman fleeing in fear, but one engaged in a solemn, purposeful ritual. Martha Rose recounted how her mother had been awake before dawn on the morning after the tragedy, preparing to attend to another birth on a neighboring plantation. From the window of her small cabin, she saw a lone figure moving through the pre-dawn mist. It was Celeste. She was not running toward the dense concealing swamps, as the official story claimed. Instead, she was walking slowly and deliberately in the opposite direction, toward the powerful churning waters of the Mississippi River. The choice of direction was symbolic and significant, a movement toward a final, cleansing oblivion, rather than a desperate scrabble for survival in the wilderness. The details of the sighting, as remembered by Martha Rose, are what give the testimony its profound and chilling impact. Celeste was not carrying provisions for a long journey. She was not dressed for a difficult escape. Her hands were empty, save for two small, tightly wrapped bundles that she held close to her chest. The bundles were wrapped in clean white linen, the same kind of fabric used for baptisms and burials. Her mother, watching from the window, understood instantly that Celeste was not carrying living children. She was carrying their remains, transformed into sacred objects for a final, terrible ceremony. Even more haunting was the sound that accompanied the grim procession. Martha Rose's mother claimed that Celeste was humming. It was not a song of sorrow, not a wail of grief, but a low, steady and powerful hum. It was a sound devoid of fear or panic, a melody that spoke of resolve and a strange, unsettling peace. It was the sound of a woman who had completed a difficult and necessary task, a priestess concluding a dark rite. This single auditory detail does more to dismantle the official narrative than any other piece of evidence. This was not the behavior of a frightened fugitive, but of a sovereign agent completing her final act. The impact of this testimony, when considered by historians decades after it was recorded, is monumental. It recasts Celeste's entire story. Her disappearance ceases to be an act of cowardice and becomes an act of will. The burned cabin is no longer an accident, but a deliberate erasure of her physical presence from the place of her bondage. The walk to the river is not a desperate flight, but a final symbolic journey, a return of her children's bodies to the great flowing artery of the continent, a force of nature far more powerful and enduring than the fleeting authority of the shepherd family. The midwife, according to her daughter, was the only person who saw Celeste that morning. She kept the knowledge of what she had seen locked away for decades, understanding that to speak of it would be to invite disbelief, ridicule, or even danger. The story of a slave woman engaging in a powerful, self-directed ritual was not one that the white community of Natchez was prepared to hear. It was a truth so far outside their understanding of the people they owned that it would have been dismissed as madness or a lie. The midwife's silence was an act of self-preservation, but also, perhaps, an act of respect for the terrible finality of what she had witnessed. This oral history, a single, fragile recording, is the ghost in the machine of the official archive. It is a voice from the other side of the social fracture, a truth that survived not on paper, but in the memory of women. It provides a narrative framework that allows us to reinterpret all the other evidence. Eleanor Shepherd's anxieties, the doctor's baffled diagnoses, the sheriff's hasty conclusions, all of these take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of a mother walking toward the river at dawn, carrying 2 linen-wrapped bundles and humming a song of terrible freedom. The irrefutable evidence, therefore, is not a document, but a story. It is a memory passed from a mother to a daughter, an image that burned itself into the midwife's mind and survived long enough to be captured by the nascent technology of historical preservation. It proves that the official record was not just incomplete, it was a deliberate fabrication designed to conceal a truth that it could not afford to confront. The true impact of this testimony is that it forces us to stop asking if Celeste acted, and to start asking the far more difficult question of why. This account transforms the macabre mystery from a simple whodunit into a complex exploration of human desperation and the nature of justice. It validates the whispers that must have circulated through the slave quarters, the unspoken belief that Celeste had not fled, but had instead achieved a form of victory. Her final walk was not an escape from punishment, but an escape from the world of bondage itself, a final, chilling assertion of her power to decide the fate of her own children, a right that had been so brutally denied to her in their lives. The official closure of the case was meant to restore order and normalcy to the shepherd plantation and the surrounding community. It was designed to cauterize the wound, to bury the tragedy under the weight of a simple, believable lie. But the historical record shows that in the years following 1844, the authority of the shepherd family, once so absolute, began to slowly and inexorably collapse from within. The shadow of the event, despite the official explanation, lingered over the house, poisoning the family's prosperity, their faith, and their very lineage, as if Celeste's act had unleashed a curse that could not be contained by a sheriff's report. Parish archives, which once documented the shepherd's prominence through records of generous donations and leadership roles in the church, begin to tell a story of withdrawal. Reverend Alistair Shepherd's name appears less and less frequently in the minutes of church council meetings. His attendance at Sunday services, once a model of consistency, becomes sporadic. The man whose voice once boomed with moral certainty from the pulpit seems to have faded into a quiet, reclusive figure, a patriarch presiding over a house that was slowly being consumed by its own unspoken grief and guilt. The family's financial authority also began to erode. Land deeds filed in the Adams County Courthouse between 1845 and 1850 show that Reverend Shepherd began to systematically sell off large parcels of his vast estate. These were not strategic sales made from a position of strength. The prices recorded were consistently well below the market value of the prime cotton-growing land. It was the action of a man desperate for liquidity, or perhaps a man desperate to rid himself of the very soil that seemed to be tainted by the memory of what had happened there. The Shepherd Empire was contracting, its foundations crumbling. The most intimate record of this collapse comes from a single private letter written by Reverend Shepherd to his brother in Charleston in 1850. The letter, discovered among the brothers' family papers in the mid-20th century, is a devastating confession of despair. He writes not of a tragic accident, but of a shadow over this house and a curse sown by wickedness that has taken root in this very soil. He describes his wife Eleanor as having succumbed to a deep and unbreakable addiction to laudanum, her days spent in a narcotic haze, a ghost drifting through the halls of her own home. His description of his son, Jonathan, is even more damning. He writes that Jonathan's marriage has remained barren, that the Lord has seen fit to deny him an heir. This detail, recorded as a matter of spiritual fact by the Reverend, is a clear and direct linking of the family's current misfortune to the past transgression. In the patriarch's mind, the deaths of his legitimate grandchildren and the subsequent infertility of his son were not separate tragedies, but connected points in a single, unfolding story of divine retribution. The sin was Jonathan's, but the punishment was being visited upon the entire family line. The collapse of the family's authority was therefore total, moral, financial, and biological. The house that once represented the pinnacle of Natchez society was becoming a hollow shell, inhabited by a broken patriarch, an addicted matriarch, and a son whose legacy was destined to die with him. The name that had once commanded so much respect was now associated with sorrow and decline. The shepherds, who had wielded the power of life and death over hundreds of enslaved people, were now powerless to stop the decay that was consuming them from the inside out. This decline can be read as a direct consequence of the moral and spiritual vacuum created by their own actions. By choosing to bury the truth of what happened, by participating in the lie that erased Celeste from history, they had created a wound that could not heal. The official story might have satisfied the community, but it could not quiet the whispers in their own hearts. They lived in the house where the crime had occurred, walked the floors where Celeste had walked, and ate from the kitchen where the fatal meal had been prepared. There was no escaping the memory. The authority of the slave master was predicated on a belief in his own inherent superiority, his own moral righteousness. The events of 1844 shattered that belief for the Shepherd family. They had been confronted with an act of resistance so absolute that it defied their entire worldview. Celeste's act was not just a crime against them, it was a judgment. She had held up a mirror to their hypocrisy, their cruelty, their spiritual bankruptcy, and the reflection had broken them. They could not punish her body, so her memory punished their souls. In the end, the system of laws and social customs that was supposed to protect the Shepherd family's authority proved to be utterly inadequate. It could close a case, file a report, and create a fiction, but it could not erase the truth. The collapse of the Shepherd family stands as a testament to the fact that moral authority, once squandered, can never be fully recovered. The curse the Reverend wrote of was not a supernatural force, but the logical and inevitable consequence of a crime that was not just committed against children, but against humanity itself. For 114 years, the story remained suspended between the official lie and the whispered legend. The Shepherd family line died out, the plantation fell into ruin, and the history of what happened was subsumed by the larger, more dramatic narrative of the Civil War and its aftermath. The truth, it seemed, was lost forever, But in 1958, a routine archaeological survey in preparation for a new highway project brought a team of state-employed surveyors to the overgrown, forgotten plot of land where the Shepherd House once stood, and history was disturbed from its long slumber. The team's field notes from that day, now housed in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, provide a detailed, objective account of the discovery that would change everything. The surveyors were working near the base of the collapsed chimney stack, clearing away decades of accumulated overgrowth, when a shovel struck something hard and metallic. Expecting a stone or a piece of old farm equipment, they dug around the object, slowly revealing the circular, lipped edge of a heavy cast-iron pot. It was a common domestic item from the period, a cooking pot, but its location and condition were highly unusual. The field notes describe its precise location with an archaeologist's care. It was buried directly beneath the foundational stone of the kitchen hearth, the symbolic and functional center of the domestic space. This was not a random placement. An object buried in such a significant location was clearly not discarded trash. It was deliberately and carefully concealed, placed in a spot that was both sacred and hidden. The pot had been sealed, its heavy lid fused to its body by a century of rust and soil compression, its contents protected from the elements. The team immediately understood that they had found something more than just a pot. The process of opening the sealed vessel is described in the notes as a slow and painstaking affair. It was transported back to a state laboratory, where technicians carefully worked to break the seal without damaging the contents. The air that was released when the lid was finally pried open was stale and ancient, the smell of time itself. The team, peering inside, was met with a sight that must have sent a chill through the sterile scientific environment of the lab. What lay within was not treasure, but the remnants of a human tragedy, a time capsule of a forgotten horror. The first items removed were the fragile, yellowed fragments of what had once been fine white linen. The fabric, though decayed, was still recognizable. Beneath the linen, nestled at the bottom of the pot, were the objects that would confirm the darkest whispers of local legend. Two small, perfectly preserved human mandibles. Forensic analysis would later confirm that they belonged to two separate children, both under the age of 3. The bones were discolored, showing signs of having been subjected to extreme heat, a detail that resonated with a terrible and inescapable implication given the pot in which they were found. This discovery of a hidden source was the pivotal moment in the reconstruction of Celeste's story. It was the irrefutable physical evidence that elevated the tale from folklore to fact. The oral testimony of Martha Rose Jackson, once a historical curiosity, was now corroborated by the stark, undeniable presence of the children's remains. The location, the hearth, and the vessel, a cooking pot, aligned with her story in a way that was too specific to be a coincidence. The bones in the pot were a physical manifestation of the bundles in the midwife's memory. But it was the final item recovered from the pot that transformed the discovery from a mere confirmation of a crime into a profound historical revelation. Lying beside the bones was a small folded scrap of parchment. Miraculously preserved by the airtight conditions inside the pot, the parchment was covered in a crude, unsteady script, the words written with a makeshift ink made from a mixture of soot and animal fat. This was not an official document or a letter. It was a final, personal testament, a message from the past left by a hand that was never supposed to write its own history. The pot and its contents represented the return of the voice that had been so systematically silenced by the official record. Celeste, erased by the sheriff's report, had left behind her own archive, a terrible and sacred collection of artifacts that told her side of the story. She had buried it in the heart of the house, directly beneath the symbol of both her servitude and her power, the kitchen hearth. It was as if she knew that the earth would hold her secret more faithfully than any human institution, waiting for a future time when the world might be ready to hear it. The discovery of this hidden source did more than just solve a historical mystery. It constituted a profound act of archival justice. It gave Celeste the final word, allowing her to speak across a chasm of more than 100 years. The contents of that pot were a direct, physical rebuttal to the official narrative that had cast her as a careless, cowardly fugitive. This was not the act of someone fleeing in panic. This was the work of someone who was meticulously and with terrifying resolve determined to ensure that the truth, in its most brutal and undeniable form, would one day be known. The contents of the iron pot force a chilling reconstruction of Celeste's final days, a narrative of a decision for decisive action born from a place of utter despair. To understand this act, one must first understand the totality of her dispossession. She was a woman who owned nothing, not even her own body. The children she had borne were not legally hers. They were the property of the man who had forced himself upon her, destined to live and die in the same system of bondage that held her. Every avenue of appeal, every hope for a different future was closed to her. It was from this position of absolute powerlessness that she forged a plan of absolute rebellion. The justification for her action is not written in any formal source, but is found in the accumulated evidence of her dehumanization. It is found in the blank space in the baptismal record, in the meager rations listed in the ledger, in the predatory gaze of Jonathan Shepherd. Her act was a response, a terrible and symmetrical reaction to the violence that had been inflicted upon her. The system had decreed that her children were not human beings, but property. In her final horrific act, she would treat them as such, reclaiming them from the world of commerce by transforming them into sacred objects for a ritual of her own devising. The preparation for this act must have been methodical and clandestine. She would have gathered the necessary herbs from the woods and gardens around the plantation, plants whose poisonous properties were known through the folk knowledge passed down among the enslaved. This knowledge, a tool for healing in other contexts, would be repurposed into a weapon of terrible precision. The choice of poison, one that mimicked a natural illness but targeted only the young, speaks to a chilling intelligence and a deep understanding of the plants that grew in the Mississippi soil. This was not an act of passion, but a calculated, deliberate execution. The feast itself was the stage for her rebellion. The kitchen, the site of her daily servitude, became her altar. The pots and pans, the instruments of her oppression, became the tools of her liberation. In preparing that final meal for the Shepherd family, she was embedding her judgment into their very sustenance. The act of poisoning the children while sparing the adults was an act of profound symbolic meaning. She was not just ending their lives, she was destroying the Shepherd family's lineage, turning their legacy to ash, ensuring that the bloodline of the man who had violated her would not continue. It was an attack not just on individuals, but on the future of the dynasty itself. After the act was done, her next steps were equally deliberate. The burning of her own cabin was not, as the sheriff claimed, an accident. It was a conscious act of erasure. She destroyed the place of her bondage, the site of her suffering and her brief, tragic motherhood. She burned her meager possessions, ensuring that nothing of her physical presence would remain on the Shepherd land. She was systematically wiping herself from the landscape, severing every tie, becoming a ghost even before she disappeared. It was a final, defiant act of purification by fire. The preparation of the iron pot was the culmination of her ritual. In placing the remains of her sons inside the cooking vessel, she was enacting a terrible, symbolic reversal. The pot that was meant to provide nourishment for the master's family now became a sepulchre for her own. She was reclaiming the instruments of her servitude and repurposing them for her own sacred, private ends. This was not desecration. In the logic of her desperate situation, it was consecration. She was transforming the products of her violation into relics of her resistance. The burial of the pot beneath the hearth was the final, crucial step. The hearth was the heart of the house, the source of warmth and food. By burying her secret there, she was placing it in the very soul of the shepherd home, ensuring that they would live out their days on top of the evidence of their own sins. It was an act of profound psychological warfare, a curse laid not with words, but with bone and iron. She was guaranteeing that her presence and the memory of her children would haunt the family and the very ground they walked on for as long as they remained there. This reconstruction of her decision reveals an actor of terrifying resolve. Celeste's actions, though monstrous, were imbued with a coherent and devastating logic. She was a woman who had been denied any form of justice by the world of men and law. So she sought another kind of justice, a primal, elemental justice that she would enact herself. Her justification was not written for others to read, but was embedded in the very fabric of her actions. She was not explaining her decision, she was becoming the decision itself. In the end, her decisive action was a final, horrific assertion of her own humanity in a world that had relentlessly denied it. It was a declaration that she, a person deemed to have no will of her own, had the power to create, to destroy, and to decide. The cost of that assertion was unimaginable, a price paid with the lives of her own children. But in the twisted moral landscape of the shepherd plantation, it may have been the only act of true freedom that was available to her. The climax of this historical investigation arrives not with a thunderous confession or a dramatic trial, but with the quiet, clinical presentation of a single, fragile artifact, the scrap of parchment found at the bottom of the iron pot. High-resolution archival photography allows us to see the document in stark detail. The parchment is rough, its edges uneven. The words are inscribed in a wavering, untrained hand, the script of someone who was likely taught to write in secret, or perhaps taught themselves. The ink, a crude mixture of soot and animal fat, has bled slightly into the fibers of the material, a testament to its humble, desperate origins. The camera holds on the image of the parchment as the words are read, the voice of the documentary presenter remaining level, sober, and devoid of any emotional inflection. This deliberate lack of dramatic emphasis forces the viewer to confront the raw power of the words themselves. The message is short, a mere 10 words, but it contains within it a complete and devastating worldview. It is Celeste's only surviving testimony, her final sermon, her last will and testament. It is the final primary source, the key that unlocks the moral and psychological heart of this entire macabre mystery. The inscription reads, "They took everything that was mine. I took back what I could." This statement, stark and simple, is a profound and chillingly rational explanation for an irrational act. The first clause, "They took everything that was mine," is a comprehensive indictment of the system of chattel slavery. It is a declaration of total dispossession. They are not just the shepherds, but the entire slave-owning society. What they took was not just her labor or her freedom of movement. They took her body, her will, her name, her past, and her future. And most crucially, they took her children, claiming legal and absolute ownership over the products of her own womb. The sentence is a summary of a life defined by theft. The second clause, "I took back what I could," is where the statement pivots from a description of victimhood to a declaration of agency. It is a chillingly logical response to the condition described in the first clause. If everything has been taken from you, the only power you have left is the power of reclamation. Celeste, denied ownership of her children in life, asserted a final absolute ownership of them in death. She could not free them into a world that would recognize their humanity, so she took them back from that world entirely, reclaiming their bodies from the ledger books of the Shepherd estate. The interpretation of this final source is the key to understanding the entire story. It reframes her act from one of madness or simple revenge into a calculated act of sovereign reclamation. It was a horrific form of accounting, a balancing of a moral ledger that was impossibly skewed. The world had made her children into things, into property. She responded by taking that property back, even if it meant destroying the very thing she was reclaiming. It was a scorched earth strategy of liberation, a final terrible act of asserting that if she could not have them as her own, then the world of her oppressors could not have them at all. This note is both a confession and a justification. It admits to the act of taking, but it frames it as a righteous taking back. It is the logic of a prisoner of war, a person operating under a different set of moral rules, a code forged in the crucible of extreme and unrelenting oppression. It asks the observer to step outside the bounds of conventional morality and to consider the possibility that in certain inhuman circumstances, the definitions of justice and monstrosity can become terrifyingly blurred. It is a document that does not ask for pity, but for a terrible and difficult form of understanding. The physical nature of the document itself is part of its power. It is not a polished, eloquent plea written for a sympathetic audience. It is a raw, private declaration written on a scrap of parchment and sealed in a pot with the bones of her children. It was a message intended not for the world that had condemned her, but perhaps for God, or for a future generation that might one day unearth it. It is the ultimate message in a bottle, a desperate communication sent out from a shipwrecked soul, a final attempt to explain an act that she knew the world would never comprehend. In the end, the parchment transforms the iron pot from a simple grave into an archive. It gives voice to the voiceless, context to the bones, and motive to the crime. It is the final, undeniable proof that Celeste was not a monster driven by insanity, but a rational actor driven to a monstrous act by an insane system. Her 10 words are a more powerful indictment of slavery than thousands of pages of abolitionist tracts, because they are written from the very heart of the abyss, a final whispered truth from a woman who decided that if she was to be damned, she would not be damned alone. The interpretation of this source marks the climax of the story. All the evidence, all the testimonies, all the silences in the record have led to this moment. The discovery of the pot posed the question of what happened. The midwife's testimony suggested how it happened, but it is only with these 10 terrible words, read aloud in the silence of an archive, that we can finally begin to understand the devastating answer to the question of why. The official, documented legacy of the Shepherd family after 1844 is one of silence and slow decay. The name that was once synonymous with wealth and power in Natchez begins to fade from the public record. Census records from the post-Civil War era show the family's presence diminishing. Jonathan Shepherd, the man at the center of the tragedy, dies childless in the 1870s, his line ending with him, just as his father had feared. The great plantation, already contracting before the war, was broken up and sold off in parcels during the turmoil of Reconstruction, its land passing into the hands of strangers. The final documented trace of the family is the sale of the last piece of property, the ruined grounds where the main house once stood, seized by the state of Mississippi in the 1880s for decades of unpaid taxes. The Shepherd name, once etched onto land deeds and parish records with such authority, disappears entirely. Their legacy, in the official sense, was erased. The curse that Reverend Shepherd had written of had run its course, leaving behind nothing but a field of weeds and a collapsed chimney, a silent monument to a family that had been consumed by its own secrets. Celeste's legacy, by contrast, is a study in transformation. Having been systematically erased from the official record, she was reborn in the unwritten oral history of the region. In the decades following her disappearance, the story of the tragedy at the Shepherd plantation was kept alive not by historians, but by the descendants of the enslaved community. The tale, passed down from one generation to the next, slowly shed its specific historical details and took on the timeless, symbolic quality of folklore. The woman named Celeste was slowly transformed into a legend. By the early 20th century, folklorists collecting stories in the Mississippi Delta began to record tales of a local haunting. They wrote of the legend of the hearth woman of the Shepherd ruin, a ghostly figure said to wander the overgrown fields near the river on moonless nights. The descriptions of the spirit were remarkably consistent. She was a beautiful, sorrowful woman, seen humming a wordless, mournful tune. The legend held that she was eternally searching for something she had buried, a precious treasure that she could never recover. This legend is Celeste's true and enduring legacy. While the Shepherds disappeared into the anonymity of historical failure, Celeste achieved a form of immortality. She became a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, a spectral presence that served as a powerful reminder of the region's brutal past. Her story, transformed into a ghost tale, became a coded way for the community to talk about the unspeakable truths of slavery, the violation of black women, the destruction of black families, and the terrible choices that were sometimes made in the face of absolute oppression. The documented consequences, therefore, present a profound and ironic reversal. The powerful family who controlled the written record, who had the authority to erase a woman from history, ultimately left no lasting trace. The powerless, enslaved woman, who was officially declared a non-person, who left behind only a single hidden message, is the one who is still remembered. Her legacy proved to be more durable because it was not tied to land or wealth, but was embedded in the collective memory of a people who understood the truth of her story on a visceral level. The physical site of the former plantation has also been transformed. Today, suburban homes and small businesses stand where cotton fields once stretched to the horizon. There are no plaques, no historical markers to indicate the human drama that unfolded there. The land itself, like the official record, has been sanitized, its violent history paved over. A visitor to the area would have no idea that they were standing on the grounds of a place that was once the setting for an extraordinary act of defiance. This invisibility is perhaps a fitting part of the legacy. The story of Celeste is about the hidden, the buried, the officially denied. Its power lies precisely in the fact that it is not a public monument, but a private, persistent whisper. The legend of the hearth woman serves as a form of guerrilla history, a story that survived and thrived outside of the official channels, a truth that refused to stay buried, even when its physical evidence was sealed in a pot and hidden in the earth for over 100 years. In the end, the consequences of Celeste's act rippled down through time in these two divergent streams. For the shepherds, the legacy was oblivion. For Celeste, it was a transformation into myth. One story ended in the dusty, forgotten files of a county courthouse. The other is still being told, a haunting and necessary ghost story that ensures that what happened in the humid lowlands of Natchez, Mississippi will never be entirely forgotten. In the final analysis, the story of Celeste exists as a ghost in the archives. She is not a fully formed historical figure, but a composite, an outline sketched from the fragmented and often contradictory sources that remain. We know her through a line in a ledger, a blank space in a parish register, the anxious scrawl in her mistress's letters, and the clinical observations of a baffled doctor. She is a presence defined primarily by the impact she had on others, her own voice almost entirely absent, save for a single terrible message that is itself an act of historical defiance. The historian's task is to assemble these fragments, to piece together a narrative from the silences and the whispers. But in a case like this, the gaps in the record are as important as the evidence itself. We will never know the precise texture of Celeste's thoughts. We will never know if she felt triumph or despair as she walked to the river at dawn. We can never fully comprehend the precise alchemy of love and rage that led her to her final act. Her soul, in the end, remains her own, a private territory that no amount of historical research can ever fully map or conquer. What the evidence does allow us to do, however, in an open question, is to challenge the simplistic moral categories that we often apply to the past. Celeste's story resists easy judgment. To call her a monster is to ignore the monstrous system that created her. To call her a hero is to ignore the horrific nature of her actions. She exists in the terrifying grey area between those two poles, a figure who forces us to confront the possibility that under conditions of absolute dehumanization, the human spirit is capable of acts that are simultaneously acts of profound love and profound violence. Her story is a testament to the violence of ownership and the terrible forms that justice can take when all other avenues are denied. It is a reminder that the institution of slavery was not just a system of labor exploitation. It was a system of profound psychological warfare, a daily assault on the very concept of selfhood. Celeste's rebellion was so total because the oppression she faced was so total. She answered the system's denial of her humanity with a final, horrific assertion of her will, a declaration that she would be the author of her own story, even if she had to write it in blood and bone. The final, open question left by her legacy is not about the past, but about the nature of history itself. How many other stories like Celeste's have been lost? How many acts of resistance, large and small, have gone unrecorded, their evidence destroyed or buried? Her story survives only because of a series of historical accidents, the preservation of an oral history, the chance discovery of a buried pot. It serves as a powerful reminder of how much of our understanding of the past is shaped by what the powerful chose to record and what they chose to erase. The true legacy of Celeste is this haunting uncertainty. She represents the vast, silent continent of the unrecorded past, the millions of voices that have been lost to history. Her story is a ghost story, not just because it involves a spirit who wanders the land, but because it is a story that has returned from the dead, a narrative that clawed its way out of the grave of the archives to demand our attention. It asks us to listen for the other whispers, to look for the other hidden sources, to question the official records, and to remember that the past is never truly past. It is always there, buried just beneath the surface, waiting. The past is a puzzle with missing pieces. The stories that are forgotten are often the ones that have the most to teach us about who we are. If you believe in the power of looking into the darkness to find the truth, then you have found a home here. Join our community of historical investigators. Subscribe to Before the Story, because the most important truths are often found not in the headlines of history, but in the footnotes, the whispers, and the silences. We will see you in the next story.